Hi, I'm Pastor Kerry. Before we get started, there are a few things I want to encourage you to have on hand. First, I want to encourage you to have a set of the sermon notes. If you don't already have them, you can go to the link that's right down below the video. It'll take you to a place where you can print a set of the sermon notes for yourself. I also want to encourage you to have some communion elements. You'll want to have some bread or a cracker. You want to have some juice or some wine, and if you don't have juice or wine, really any beverage would probably suffice. But you'll want to have those communion elements because here in about 20 minutes, when we get to the end of the sermon, we'll move right into a time of communion with you. So, if you need any of those things, then I would encourage you to pause the playback. Get whatever you need. Once everything's in place, then go ahead and resume the video. So, it was exactly 40 years ago this month that one of the most infamous moments in baseball history took place. It was a visiting team in Yankee Stadium that was trailing 4-3 going into the ninth inning. And they had 2 outs, they had 1 person on base, and the batter stepped up to the plate and hit a home run that put the visiting team ahead of the Yankees. Now they were up 5-4. The batters circled the bases, the base runner, and then the batter circled the bases. And after the batter had returned to the dugout a hero, Billy Martin came out to the home plate umpire and said, blah, 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 blah. And so then the home plate umpire went to the visiting team's dugout and asked to see the bat that had just been used to hit what appeared to be the go-ahead, potentially game-winning home run. Umpire took it out, rolled it around on the ground, and then after rolling the bat around on the ground, declared that the batter who had just hit what appeared to be the go-ahead, maybe the game-winning, the home run, declared George Brett, the future Hall of Famer, to be out. Game over. And if you remember the highlights of that game, you know that George Brett went ballistic, went crazy. And if I had been in his shoes, I probably would have done the exact same thing. Now, why did he get called out? Well, this was the infamous pine tar incident, where there was a rule in baseball that said that you were allowed to have pine tar on your bat, but it was supposed to be down at the bottom of the bat where the grip was. The pine tar was not supposed to go too high up onto the batting surface of the bat. Now, this was an antiquated rule that went back to early baseball history when they would only use a few baseballs over the course of the entire game. Not like Major League Baseball today, where they use a new baseball for practically every pitch of the game, which ends up being how many? Dozens, scores, hundreds of baseballs over the course of a game. Back then, they would try to get through the entire game with just a few baseballs. And because they would try to get through the entire game with just a few baseballs, they didn't want the pine tar to be up on the batting surface of the bat because the pine tar would then stick to the baseball and would mess up the baseball. That's where the rule came from. It's not like having pine tar up on the batting surface of the bat gave the batter a competitive advantage. If anything, I would say that having the sticky substance too far up on the batting surface probably gave the batter a competitive disadvantage. But regardless, George Brett had pine tar too far up on the batting surface of the bat. Now, as you would imagine, the Kansas City Royals then protested the game. And the interesting thing was, it was just a few days later that the American League Commissioner upheld their protest and said, you guys are going to have to resume this game as soon as possible, and you're going to have to play out the rest of the top of the ninth and the rest of then the bottom of the ninth. And as some of you know, they did in fact do that. And as it turned out, that when they resumed the game, the Yankees ended up losing that game 5-4, as they probably should have. As far as I'm concerned, I am no Yankees fan. But the reason that the American League Commissioner said, yeah, I know that that's what the rules say, but the American League Commissioner said, that calling him out for having pine tar too high up on the batting surface of the bat, that it violated the spirit of the game. And the reason that he upheld the Royals' protest was it was in the best interest of the spirit of the game. And the reason that I bring that up is because in the lectionary gospel reading for this coming Sunday, July 9th of 2023, Jesus is going to be addressing the letter of the law as opposed to the spirit of what God intended with the law. So, having prefaced it that way, let's take a look at our lectionary gospel reading. Again, this is for July the 9th of 2023. This is Matthew 11:28, and we'll continue on through chapter 12, verse 14. Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some of the heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." Jesus answered, "Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath, and yet are innocent? I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, 'I desire mercy, not sacrifice,' you would not have condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Going on from that place, Jesus went into their synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus, they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" And Jesus said to them, "If any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Then Jesus said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." So the man stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other. But the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. May God bless the reading of the inspiring and thought-provoking word. So, I am pretty sure that you've heard all of the aspects of this passage before. "Come unto me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." I'm sure that the vast majority of the people who are going to watch this video have heard that passage before. The story of Jesus and the disciples walking through the fields and the disciples eating some of the grain even though it was the Sabbath. You probably remember that story. Jesus healing the man with the withered hand even though it was the Sabbath. You're probably familiar with that as well. But it's interesting when we look at all of these in relation to one another because all of these things happen consecutively. So what I want to do right now is what we always do. I want to talk through the passage. I want to offer a little additional explanation on a number of the verses in this passage. After we talk through the passage, then what I want to do is I want to focus on three of the truths that this passage has for us. So the passage starts with that well-known saying of Jesus, "Come unto me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me." And of course, we know that a yoke was a huge, a wooden, basically like a plank almost, that was carved in a way that it would fit over the shoulders and the neck of an ox or some other beast of burden. So that with this huge, heavy yoke that they would carry along, then they could pull a plow behind them, or they could drag the threshing wheel around, whatever the case may be. That was the purpose of the yoke. It was to put on a beast of burden so that then they could do hard labor. And Jesus is saying, I want you, instead of taking that yoke that you people, that figurative yoke that you've always carried around, I want you to take my yoke upon you. Because the task, the responsibility that I am going to give you says it's going to be easy, it's going to be light. We're going to come back and we're going to talk more about that here in a few minutes. But then as we continue into chapter 12, it tells us the story of the time that Jesus was with the disciples. They're traveling through the fields and the disciples are hungry. And so they start picking some of the kernels of wheat out of these fields that they're walking through, and they start eating them. Now, the religious leaders at that time saw what was happening, and they were immediately critical of the disciples, and by extension critical of Jesus, and said, Jesus, your disciples aren't supposed to be doing that. Now, some of you know why. For those of you who don't, the fact that they were picking these grains of wheat as they were walking past them, and the fact that they were eating them, that was considered to be work. And you were not supposed to work on the Sabbath, because one of the 10 Commandments is to honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. And as far as they were concerned, thousands of years ago, you were not supposed to work on the Sabbath. To work on the Sabbath was to fail to honor the Sabbath. You'll notice that isn't actually recorded in the Old Testament itself. That was a rule that the people had added on. Now, we could have a whole nother conversation about all of the rules that they added on thousands of years ago just to make sure that they would never break one of the 10 Commandments. But the point is that it does seem a little bit ridiculous for them, if they're hungry, to not even be able to reach out and to grab a kernel and just to eat under those circumstances. That's what they did. But as far as the religious leaders were concerned, they had done something wrong. Now Jesus, as you might imagine, has something to say about that. He says, you guys are wrong. You religious leaders are wrong for criticizing my disciples for doing that. And then he cites for them the occasion when David and David's men had gone into the temple and they had eaten the bread that was only supposed to be for the priests there in the temple. Then he also talks about how the priests in the temple, that they had to work on the Sabbath when it was their turn to be in the temple on the Sabbath day. And he says, that's allowed, so why can't my disciples work on the Sabbath? And then Jesus talks in verse 7 about a verse that we actually talked about just a few weeks ago. If you've been watching these sermons every week, you know that a few weeks ago we talked about this passage from Hosea 6:6, where it says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, where God was speaking through the prophet Isaiah and saying, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. We talked about it a few weeks ago, but if you didn't see that online sermon, then just very quickly to recap, the point that God was making through the prophet Isaiah was this. There were people who were so concerned about following the rules to the letter that they were so busy making the sacrifices that were required of them that they had forgotten to do the more important thing, which was to exercise mercy with the people in their lives. And so God was frustrated and was saying through the prophet Hosea, God was saying through the prophet Hosea, don't you realize that I would much rather have you be merciful and be kind and be forgiving with the people that are in your life than I am about the sacrifices that you're supposed to come and make in the temple. That is the point that God made, and that is the point that Jesus has made now a couple of times as we've gone through these gospel readings. He made it in Matthew chapter 9. Now he's making it once again in Matthew chapter 12. And so Jesus is basically saying, stop being so legalistic about things. And then it almost feels like a setup. Then Jesus goes with these religious leaders back to their synagogue, and there just happens to be a man there who Jesus could heal because he has a shriveled hand. And in fact, it really feels like a setup when they say to Jesus, Jesus, oh, check it out. There's a guy there who has a shriveled hand. Is it lawful for you to heal him on the Sabbath? And Jesus says, if one of you had a sheep that fell into the pit on a Saturday, you wouldn't let your sheep stay down there and die. You would go down and you would save that sheep. And that would be considered work, but you would do it because it's the right thing to do. It says, so if you, religious leaders, would do that, why wouldn't I save this man's hand? And that's exactly what he did. He healed the man. And it says that at that point that they decided that it was time for them to look for a way to bring Jesus' life to an end. So, what I want us to do now is I want us to very quickly talk about 3 of the truths that this passage conveys to us. And the first truth is this. As disciples, Jesus wants us to find rest in Him. Again, going back to Matthew 11, 28 through 30. Come unto me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. And look, I don't need to tell you. I feel like I'm going to sound like I'm some old-fashioned person when I say this, but you know how busy all of us are. You know that all of us, or the majority of us, have so many things going on in our lives, and we don't get enough sleep at night, and we don't get enough rest. And friends, one of the things that Jesus was trying to tell these people thousands of years ago, and by extension I think Jesus is still trying to say to us today, is look, if you choose to live your life by following me and following my teachings, you will find that elusive rest. The rest, not only that your physical body needs, but the rest, even more importantly, that your soul and your spirit needs. And friends, don't most of us need that? Even pastors in this day and age, don't we need a little bit more peace and rest in our souls, in our spirits? Friends, that is one of the things that Jesus offers us. But we have to be willing to come and follow Jesus with every aspect of our lives. In fact, we'll come back and we'll talk about that a little bit more here in a couple minutes. So that is the first truth. The second truth is this. As disciples, there are times when we must look beyond the letter of the law. As disciples, there are times when we must look beyond the letter of the law. Now, if you're wondering where I'm going to go with this, if you're wondering if I'm about to say something heretical, I don't think that I'm about to say something heretical, but friends, this book is the book that I have committed my entire life to, and I love this book. But there are times when we have to go above the letter of the law. That's exactly what Jesus was saying here in this section when he talks about how David and David's men went into the temple and they ate the bread that wasn't for them, or talked about how the priests that had to work on the Sabbath, had to perform the priestly duties, were working on the Sabbath, and nobody was yelling at them about that. Jesus was saying there are times when you have to go above the letter of the law. And Jesus then proved it by healing the man with the shriveled hand, even though it was the Sabbath. And again, earlier we talked about how the baseball commissioner said, that's ridiculous for you to call George Brett out because he's got pine tar too far up on his baseball bat. That violates the spirit of the game. And friends, I think that there are times when some people, when some of us, when we get so hung up on all of the little tiny letters of the law that sometimes we lose sight of doing what is right in the spirit of the greatest commandment. Love your Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. We get so caught up on following all the little tiny letters of the law that sometimes we lose sight of the fact that, just like Jesus said, God talks about how we need to exercise mercy rather than being hung up on all of the legalistic things that you're supposed to do, like sacrifices. Friends, you and I, in this day and age, we need to show mercy. We need to show love. We need to show kindness and compassion. And that got hung up on all of the little things. So I want to challenge you to think about that. Are there times when you and I both, that we need to look beyond the letter of the law? Because I think that just like there were Pharisees 2,000 years ago, I think there are still Pharisees today. And I don't want to be one of them. I hope you don't want to be one of them either. That is the second truth this passage has for us. The third truth is this. As disciples, we must remember that one way is better than all the others, and that is Jesus' way. As disciples, we must remember that one way is better than all the others, and that is Jesus' way. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, well, gosh, Carrie, that's a pretty obvious thing. Gosh, I don't think you're telling us anything particularly profound there. I want to challenge you on that as well. Because the overriding theme in this passage, when Jesus says, "Come unto me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." And then when he's walking through the fields and saying to the people that are criticizing the disciples for eating, and then when they're trying to say to him, "Oh, Jesus, there's this guy over here that you could heal, but should you do that? Should you really?" And the point that Jesus was making through this entire passage is that there is a greater way for all of us. And friends, that way is Jesus' way. It's the way that says, I am going to put others ahead of the letter of the law. When I'm going to make a priority of doing the things that Jesus would have me do. And the reason that I bring that up is because I think for some of us, what we have to ask ourselves is, whose way am I following? Am I doing my best as a disciple, as a Christian, as a Christ follower? Am I doing my best to do things Jesus' way? Or am I trying to do things Carrie's way? Am I trying to do things my way? Or, for that matter, am I trying to do the things that society is encouraging me to do? Am I trying to do the things that my favorite political party or my favorite pundit on TV wants me to do? Because, friends, I am convinced that if it comes to a choice between doing things my way or your way, or the way of society, or the way of your favorite political party, or the way of your favorite pundit on TV, and in some cases, the way that maybe your parents are pressuring you, or your spouse is pressuring you, or your children are pressuring you. Friends, all of those might not be the worst ways in the world, but I promise you that Jesus' way is the best way. And I want to challenge you today to really think about that. And friends, as we prepare to conclude, I would just remind you of Jesus' words in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, as recorded by the Apostle Paul. When Jesus was with the disciples in the upper room, he took bread and broke it and said, "This is my body which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." So right now, go ahead and get your communion elements as I grab mine. And even though the video is going to cut me off, I would invite you to go ahead and partake with me at this time. Friends, the body of Christ, broken for us, we partake in remembrance of him. And the blood of Christ, shed for us, we